Deciding what to say in this first intro has actually been one of the hardest parts of making this series, because I just don't come at this game from the angle that a lot of folks do. I didn't pre-order it, I don't consider myself a documentarian of video games in general. I'm really more of the tinkerer sort, where I hang out on a lot of Discord servers and subreddits dedicated to hacking games, mostly just to kind of like see what's over the horizon or little bits left over from what was cut in development, just mostly to learn more about how my favorite games are made and things like that. And that's actually what brought me to this game. I was sitting there on the 11th or 12th of December 2020, minding my own business, when a friend of mine came to me with a flash drive saying, "Hey, you like big broken video games, you've got to check this out. This new Cyberpunk game, it's like Skyrim times 5 on day one, and it's really something else." And so, naturally I was intrigued by this. I think I made the Tim Allen sound, the "oh," and I immediately popped it in my computer and started looking at it. And it's interesting to me that although my first experience with this game was coming in with just that expectation, having not pre-ordered it, I definitely enjoyed the Witcher games. I wouldn't consider myself a super fan of CD Projekt Red or really any other game company that much these days. I just kind of play what comes out that looks good. I'm really not a big hype person or anything like that, so coming into this game, my only knowledge was this thing is big, it's a big deal, and it's pretty broken at launch. And that definitely pretty much was my experience starting out with the game. I saw a lot of the things that CD Projekt Red had kind of, thrown together at the last minute to make the game basically functional. And my first knee-jerk reaction was honestly, what in the hell? Like, how could people who know how to make video games even put a game together like this? And for something like that to evolve over the years into something I consider one of my favorite games ever, and something that I think has some of the most elegant and efficient solutions to displaying things on screen in a video game. A large part of how I ended up doing so is I ran into Mike and his channel Deconstructing the Game, and I offered to help him out with using console commands and mods on PC to help with his search for cut content and things that were kind of left over from things shown off earlier. And this is where I became aware that over the course of the game's development, a lot of different things had been said about what the game would include. Things had been shown off in teasers and trailers that didn't reflect the actual final shape of the game. And this is the stuff that people have been saying over the years: fix this, add this back in, what about this? And this is where a lot of the stuff that's come from, like the more advanced police system, the metro system, a lot of the stuff that's been added in the patches and updates since the game's release come from this expectation of what this game was supposed to include and what it was supposed to be. And in the interest of looking for a lot of the remnants of this, I started working with Mike on Deconstructing the Game, and we made all kinds of videos about that. I had a really good time doing that, and it's something that I'm glad I worked on those videos, but I've always in the back of my mind kind of wanted to make a video documenting what I saw going patch by patch, week by week through that period of the game's development, and seeing the changes in how they were actually working on systems like the NPC AI and the quest pathing, all the stuff that was driving people crazy and was the most broken, what they were implementing trying to fix it, because it was really interesting from a game development standpoint. And now, after the dust is all settled and everyone else has kind of gotten to make their documentaries talking about gathering everyone's opinions and how everyone felt and how angry we were and all that stuff, I want to talk about my boring technical stuff. And it seems that a few people at least are interested in is like, okay, well, what was broken? How was it broken? And what did they actually do to fix it? So that's what this is about, is how Cyberpunk 2077 evolved from one of the most broken games probably ever released into what I would consider probably the best open world game engine at this point, and I really don't think that, considering apples to apples, there's another game that does as much on this scale as Cyberpunk 2077 does on Red Engine 4. And I'm one of the people now that's a little disappointed they're leaving the engine behind, seeing what they were actually able to accomplish with it. So let's talk about the development of Cyberpunk 2077, going all the way back to the beginning. I gotta be honest, I hate long YouTube video intros. I am like the first to be clicking on "don't show me this person again" when somebody starts telling me their life story or explaining to me what a video game is like I've never seen one before. But because I promise this will actually become relevant later in this series, let's talk a little bit about the background of the Cyberpunk franchise of tabletop role-playing games. The Cyberpunk role-playing franchise is a creation of Mike Pondsmith, who, with his company Artelsorian Games, has been publishing versions of the Cyberpunk pen and paper role-playing game since the late 80s. Though it would be the 1990s 2020 edition that most of us are familiar with. That was kind of the peak of the series, and it was actually in sort of a hiatus when CD Projekt Red came along in 2012 and approached Pondsmith about doing a video game adaptation. Although additional materials would eventually fill out the world and alternate timeline of Cyberpunk's universe, the primary setting of the Cyberpunk role-playing games is Night City, which is actually in the former location of Morro Bay, a city that exists in our world, but after earthquakes and drought have devastated the California coast in Cyberpunk's version of history, gangs have completely taken over the area, and entrepreneur Richard Knight is able to purchase the area and reshape it into what he calls a free city, Night City. Fun little aside to the real-world connection, Morro Bay is an area that Mike Pondsmith liked to hang out on the weekends when he was in college. And I've actually been to the area myself, and there's a whole bunch of historical stuff and little museums, a lot of which talk about and glorify the brief time during which California was an independent republic. And it's not a huge surprise that people who have gone there would, kind of formulate in their minds concepts like the Free City of Night City or the New California Republic in Fallout or various things like that. You can kind of see the inspiration if you go to the real world area. So there is a little bit of relevance to it, and I will actually touch back on this later. With that bit of back information though, you should be pretty well caught up to 2012 when the genesis of Cyberpunk the video game took place. Now, I want to just finish up my intro with a little disclaimer here. I'm only going to be showing the most commonly known leaked footage of the game before release. In the past, I've not used leaked footage at all if it was stolen by hacking and so on and so forth. But I'm just going to kind of say it's like when the cat's fully out of the bag and stuff has already been shown, it's fine, also because that's not likely to get the video taken down, and my goal is of course that you're able to watch the video. So sorry for those people who would just like to see the rarest, juiciest leaked footage. You're going to have to just troll 4chan yourself. But this is all going to come from the Cyber El Bagato and the 2 or 3 other biggest leaks that have already been shown in a lot of YouTube videos when I'm showing and talking about the 2013 to 2016 era of Cyberpunk's development. So sorry to anyone that disappoints, but again, my goal is that people actually get to watch these videos before they get taken down. It takes a fair amount of effort to make them. So without further ado, let's start talking about Cyberpunk's early development and clear up a few misconceptions about this period that have honestly widely been incorrectly reported even by professional journalists. This notorious leaked video clip has launched a million rumors and incorrect statements, and I want to clear up some things about this real quick. And also, so I'm not a journalist, I'm not going to be doing an exhaustive bibliography in the description, but everything that I say is a statement from CD Projekt Red. I'm referring to things either from Pavel Sasko's streams or from videos on CD Projekt Red's official YouTube channel showing interviews. None of this is deep info that is hard to find. It's mostly just been skimmed over because journalists are unbelievably lazy now and just pull stuff straight off 4chan and go to print with it. But it's widely been said that this was evidence that the game was in development for years as a third-person game and just kind of went into development hell before it finally became the game that we recognize. And this is completely inconsistent with what CD Projekt Red themselves have said about the period that this came from. This video, by the way, was dated internally 2013 in the files that were leaked and hacked from CD Projekt Red. And they've said that they created a prototype or proof of concept build, and at this time they were at the Witcher 2 Xbox 360 version level of Red Engine, which was Red Engine 2. And they made this as just kind of a proof of concept to show around internally and say, hey, you know, we think we could do this world with our technology. We're working towards this new version, Red Engine 3 for The Witcher 3. And, you know, we think it's going to be possible to realize this big open world. And this is what they most likely shopped around to Mike Pondsmith to convince him to give them the license and all sorts of things. But this was not ever intended to be the actual game, and development did not continue consistently on from 2013 on to 2016 when the game development proper picked up and they started moving everyone over from the Witcher 3 team from working on the DLC to start developing Cyberpunk 2077 in earnest. This was seriously just a proof of concept, and CD Projekt Red has stated this on numerous occasions, yet that has not stopped a legion of YouTubers and lazy journalists from saying that Cyberpunk 2077 was originally supposed to come out in 2016 as a third-person game, you know, reference this video from big CD Projekt Red hack, and, you know, it just... As somebody that's like, I don't consider myself a huge nitpicker that goes through and checks the references on every single story that I read, but when you're really just going out to just kind of like slander a company and bash their reputation and call them lazy and say that they're bad at their jobs, the way that I did that was by actually taking a look at their game and tearing it apart with console commands and analyzing, you know, how it was and wasn't built. Whereas just taking lazy statements like that to just jump on a bandwagon of bashing them, that's lazy. And it's like, you know, as a YouTuber, I have the right to do that. But journalists really are not supposed to, and there are actually rules that are supposed to strictly govern how much just crap they can pull out of their butts and throw on the page. And I feel that that standard has been really eroded. So yeah, I'm not going to go off on too much more rant about that, but that is something that's been widely incorrectly reported about this game that is absolutely not true. So more about this build though. What's cool about it is you can definitely see that this, you know, very much looks like The Witcher 2, but also there are remnants of this mock-up quest that they put together for this build in the final game. You can see that the character is doing a gig for someone called Dexter Deshawn. It involves someone named Sandra Dorset. These are characters that make it all the way into the final game, though their roles and the situations are changed. Now, I also just add Red Engine 3 with an asterisk here because they were developing Red Engine 3 at the time, and so some of that technology may have made it into this build. That's unknown, but it's just speculative. In January 2013, all of us would be introduced to the partnership between CD Projekt Red and Artel and their new project Cyberpunk 2077. This fully CG teaser trailer, which, you know, doesn't promise anything about gameplay, shows us this lady in some sort of medical garment who seems to have escaped from a hospital or facility. The police are very angry with her. Everything about this teaser screams accuracy to the original universe. Mike Pondsmith has said in many different ways and on different occasions that the whole point of playing a session of Cyberpunk is to wreak some havoc and look badass doing it. And that's pretty much the one sentence explanation of what this woman is doing in this teaser. And so this set expectations pretty high that, hey, you know, the people who made the Witcher games and a classic role-playing franchise that a lot of us who grew up in that period and, you know, played the top 5 at least 90s role-playing games were like, oh man, it's that, and those guys are like, oh man, and it looks just like I always pictured it in my mind, you know, this is going to be fantastic. And I actually feel though that this is the beginning of CD Projekt Red setting the wrong expectation, because this character actually does exist in the game. Melissa Rory is an NPC that you run into, and this is her backstory of being a cyber psycho that becomes a member of MaxTag. But CD Projekt Red started to imply that your character would be able to pursue any of these different life paths just as if you were playing the tabletop role-playing game. And anyone who's played the final game knows that this isn't the case. You play as V, who has 3 set life paths, and then your dialogue choices is really all you do to change the character from then on out. And it's just a small thing, but I feel like this started to set an expectation that was incorrect about the game they were developing early on, and CD Projekt Red did not clarify this as much as they could have. For the next few years, while CD Projekt Red was primarily focused on developing The Witcher 3, all we really know about this period is that at this point talks took place with Mike Pondsmith about how to realize the world. A lot of concept art was done. We can see just by the dates on when concept artists have dated their work. And beyond that, it appears that no real development was done on the actual game and game engine until around 2016, which matches what CD Projekt Red has said. Even from the leaked files and what we can see of dates, that appears to be accurate. The only actual physical evidence we've seen of this point in development are a few leaked clips, most of which is an internal bug reel that the developers seem to have just distributed amongst themselves for humor purposes. And a lot of people have looked at this footage and jumped on it to say, oh, look at what a mess this game was, and, look at what incompetent fools CD Projekt Red are. But as one of the people that watches every little bit of boring documentary that's ever included with games and wishes that, honestly, if they would give all the internal info and assets to someone better than me at making this documentary right now, and I could be watching it instead of making it, that would be awesome. I wish the game industry was way more open about this stuff. But that being said, and just speculating based on what we have, I think it's kind of incorrect for people to jump on this and say, oh, this game's development was a mess, because having watched a lot of that stuff, every game looks like this at this stage. In the first couple of years, when they're just testing stuff out and putting it together, games are a total mess. And there are also a lot of things that people don't understand just about game development, looking at it from the finished game and then reeling back and assuming that it's like this step-by-step direct process. It's funny, it's like people assume that games are built like a Lego structure where you start and build it with the intention of the final product following instructions or something. But in reality, games are built with a whole bunch of pieces that don't come together until the last minute. Sometimes they aren't even all in place at the last minute, as we saw with this game. And in practice, this means that people are working on a lot of different versions of the game within the development studio. The sound people, for example, might be working on a build of the game that doesn't have all of the art assets in it, because all they're doing is testing sound triggers over and over again all day, and they don't need a bunch of other stuff taking up space on their computers. And so when you look at footage of someone working on the game, they could be working on a build of the game that only contains the necessary assets for what they're working on. And it's only in testing builds and preview builds where everything gets cobbled together and is workable of a state as possible to show to someone else, like the general public or investors. Now, other things about this that are kind of misleading is that it's really easy to make a game look funky when just a few little pieces are missing, when a stage of an animation is missing, or when one model in order is missing and so things get renumbered. A lot of this stuff can happen, and you can cause stuff like this to happen in games just by screwing around with console commands and doing all sorts of different things to break the game. And so while it might have been fun for the developers to sit around and do this stuff just to, show off how broken something was and how frustrating it was for them to work on it, it doesn't necessarily mean that a game is super far from completion. Like, some of this stuff can be in the game and causing weird bugs right up until late in development, but they have a backup, less advanced version of the physics engine or something like that that they can implement to make the game just function on a basic level. And so there's a lot of stuff like that that developers could show you from when they're working on a game that doesn't necessarily mean that the game could not be completed or put together. A lot of that is misleading. Now, To say that this game was not having a troubled development at that point and was maybe not ready to be released in 2020, I would definitely say that a lot of this supports that. When you have this many things that look this bad, and some of this footage looks to be from a later date because all sorts of later assets are in the game, that definitely leads one to believe that maybe the game, it wasn't quite as baked as the investors and the people on the board would like to have believed, and that the developers knew this internally. Now, they've made a number of statements. There's been a few disgruntled former CD Projekt Red employees that have said a few things publicly, so this isn't entirely speculation, but as much as possible, I want to stick to looking at what we've seen and just trying to base my analysis on that. Now, that being said, I would like to say I can make some fairly educated speculation, just as someone who got a Game Genie for my Nintendo at the tender age of 7 and has been tearing apart games trying to figure out how they were made ever since. This game definitely has the appearance of struggling with scale and implementation. You can see that it's a huge game. The thing about Cyberpunk is, even to this day, there are not a lot of other games you can name that are so big, have so many enterable structures, have so much stuff going on at once, and also give you the freedom to do so many things just out of nowhere. You can blow up a bunch of stuff, you can fling yourself through the air, you can travel really fast or really high. There's a lot of things you can do suddenly that the game needs to be able to react to. It's a fairly interactive game as things go. Whereas if you were to compare it to other games like, say, Red Dead Redemption 2 or Grand Theft Auto 5, there's a lot going on in those games as well, but there's fairly simplistic reactions from the systems within the game, and you're not really expected to be scrutinizing up close a lot of the things that are very visible in Cyberpunk 2077. And it takes a lot of these things to a level that it's fair to say that it was pretty unprecedented, at least in the earlier part of the game's development, and is still pretty competitive with other open world games by the time the game released. So although I definitely feel that mistakes were made, I'm gonna, say things to that effect at numerous points while talking about this game's development. I have a lot of respect for the ambition of what CD Projekt Red was trying to accomplish here, and when basically looking at this footage, just like seeing them with their pants down, and they intentionally, like thinking that only their coworkers were going to see this footage, they made it silly and showed some of the worst parts of what they were working on, so we really get to see it warts and all in a way that generally is not shown to the public. And even so, these are the honest mistakes of developers trying to make a really big and complex game that lets you do a lot of stuff. That it's a dream for an open world gamer wanting to be able to run around and live fantasies of doing cyberpunk stuff. And they delivered on that in a lot of ways, and even in a lot of the ways that they talked about doing things that weren't fully implemented in the game as released. It's still a pretty large and ambitious game. Now, that I feel is almost like a disclaimer of being positive, and we have to get a little negative on some of this stuff, is I feel like another of the biggest problems with Cyberpunk 2077's development is lack of solid leadership all the way up and down the chain. When you look at a lot of this stuff, it looks like a lot of time was spent where people just didn't really know what to do or where to go next, who to talk to fix things, and they were just kind of screwing around making stuff like this, and there were major pieces that needed to come together, and people were maybe not aware of where and when that was going to happen. This is entirely speculative, but just looking at how these videos were put together, you get this feeling that someone is sitting there at their desk and they're like, okay, I made this thing that was my job, and I know what it is and what it does in the game, but I have no idea who I'm supposed to contact, of like, when, what department puts this into the build, like where's the pipeline, who do I talk to? And so they're just sitting around being like, okay, the clock is ticking, and they're selling more merchandise and nonsense, and here I am not knowing how to implement this thing that I'm working on into the game, and it's still totally incomplete and a bunch of disjointed pieces. And yeah, that's just kind of, I guess, the feeling I get looking at this footage. And is echoed also somewhat by the statements that have been made by former CD Projekt Red employees. I always feel bad talking about it. It's like anytime you talk about somebody else's breakup, I feel like you have to take everything with a grain of salt, because you're hearing from the people who lost their jobs, which is going to taint their views on it somewhat, versus the people who are still employed there making a paycheck. And so we can't entirely just say that every, person who is angry that no longer works there, and, people who were artists who came in, midpoint in development and saw the chaos at that point and say, oh yeah, people, I had no idea. I was just throwing a folder on a random desk and hoping the right person got it. Those kind of statements should always be taken with a grain of salt when you're looking at someone else's breakup from the outside. But that being said, a lot of the statements that we've heard about the 2016 to 2019 period of Cyberpunk's development really give a strong impression of chaos, of the company and the game itself were trying to scale up and grow to make this big behemoth. And there were a lot of parts, both on the technical level and in the management level, missing in the middle to make it really cohesive and smooth, the way companies who've done this a bunch of times before, making a game on this scale, learn how to do this. Now that I've mentioned it, I feel I have to discuss another elephant in the room: Cyberpunk's marketing campaign and merchandising. Now, I have to kind of start off by saying that I'm not a person who buys Funko Pops or things like that, so my opinion would be that all of this stuff is useless crap, but that is beside the point. What I really think this did of selling all of this ridiculous merchandise for this game was that it created this concept that CD Projekt Red and the game itself, just to kind of phrase it as an entity, since people seem to kind of view products as entities and corporations as entities for some reason, it developed this aura and reputation of being greedy. And the concept that they were just out to make money off of their fans rather than satisfy them really stuck with it from the point where they started selling this. I mean, look at some of this ridiculous crap. As much as marketing and merchandising is not normally something I care about, again, I'm not a pre-orderer, I don't buy any of this stuff. Where I think this really crossed over the line into being part of the game's legacy and history, and part of that of the gaming industry in general, is how far it went, especially with this, and that was this licensed Xbox One X that they released years before the game came out that promised to include the game as well as its first DLC. Now, as you may know by the controversy that came years after this, by the time the game and its DLC actually came out, support for Cyberpunk 2077 was cut off at the 1.63 patch version on the previous generation consoles by that time, because we were now several years into the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles. And long story short, the DLC was not released on or expansion, as they would say, because everybody is all about this distinction between expansion and DLC. Honestly, I don't care. The fact is, it didn't come out on this ridiculous console that looks like something out of Cyberpunk's world, and that they went into all this effort of creating and marketing. It's just ridiculous, honestly, and anyone wanting to poke fun at a company or a product, when you have something like this that is just an absolute kick-me sign on your back of a console that is styled after your game and promises an included copy of its first expansion, and then that doesn't even release on that generation of console. It's pretty much the epitome of overhyping and bringing anticipation to an unnecessary level way too early just to make a few extra bucks. I am going to try to rein in my rants about the evils of the industry and corporations in general in these videos, as much as I feel that it's very in-universe for Cyberpunk 2077. There's a reason that I don't pre-order games and pay attention to hype and any of that. Years as a gamer, I've realized that it just does not really add anything to the experience versus how much frustration it brings to start hyping games way before they come out, start letting marketing with all of its just crazy over-the-top nonsense hyperbolic promises about what this game is going to be fill all this stuff in my mind. It's like I remember all the way back to when Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace came out, dating myself a little bit here, but sitting there in front of my computer just making fake opening crawls for Star Wars movies with my typing program and sending them to my friends back and forth, and just the like massive amount of hype obsession. We were just sitting there like, oh, please, please, please let it be the day that it's out. Like, just put me in a medically induced coma and wake me up when Star Wars is out. And looking back on it, it's like, yes, we were disappointed initially when that came out. I think it's another great example of something that people's opinions have changed on over time. But the whole concept of just getting yourself into this fever pitch to where you practically can't wait for something, and if it's anything less than a holy gospel, it's going to let you down. And that really doesn't bring anything to you. Just in general, these corporations, they're not your friends, they're not your family, they're not a club that represents you. They're just going to get money out of you by any means necessary. And a lot of them, I think they don't even have mirrors in their house, so they have to look at themselves in the morning, because I can't imagine how they could. Because we've done things like repealing the laws stopping companies from directly linking toys and cartoon shows on TV, and all this kinds of stuff, of where we just overtly, at least in the United States, use manipulation and techniques that were, honestly, some of them were developed for mind control by the CIA, and we now use them to convince kids to get their parents to buy them stuff. And that's, where we come from with a lot of this stuff. So the more you let that affect you, it's not going to make you happier or make you enjoy your products anymore. This is just my little rant before we move on in the video, but buying into any hype, buying expensive crap and putting it on your shelf so that you can stare at it and obsess about this thing and start filling your head full of ideas of what it's going to be, it just doesn't do you any favors. And you'll be a much happier person if you just focus on what you have here in front of you right now. Enjoy the games you already have. Play some stuff out of your back catalog. Find something wholesome to do with your time, rather than obsessing with something that, it may honestly turn out to be an utter pile of crap. And they may not put several years into fixing it, like CD Projekt Red has done with Cyberpunk 2077. So, end rant, just wanted to share that of, hey, if you were someone who was burned by this game because you spent a whole bunch of money in anticipation and then it didn't live up to those lofty expectations, part of it is, yes, corporations are evil, welcome to Earth. But also, you can change your own actions and your own expectations to prevent that from happening in the future. And I think that's something that a lot of people learned from this game. And I don't even remember what the first product was. Maybe it was Star Wars that did it for me. But I highly recommend that people take that lesson rather than just going and ranting at the company and, finding different ways that they can express their anger and frustration about this thing not living up to their expectations. Try to learn from the experience. Don't pre-order games. Over 30 minutes in, and we're finally getting to the part where most people were introduced to the hype about this game, the 2018 E3 trailer. Now, you notice it just said game engine footage. This is something that's misleading to a lot of people. A lot of people see any reference to in-game game engine and assume that that means that the game is up and running and that people are playing it. Now, all of these assets that you see here, I don't think they're lying that this was all made in engine. All this stuff is still pretty much present. You can find a bunch of old NPC models that appear in this video, or a lot of stuff is still parts that appear in the game. But having played through the whole game and seen the whole picture and where they just kind of pulled all this stuff from and put it all together just to put this trailer together, you can tell that, the game was not fully complete and up and running at this point. They just had a bunch of random assets that they could put together to where when you put the camera in a certain direction, it looked like a video game. And that's usually what they're talking about when they say in-engine footage rather than real gameplay or anything like that. So I don't think that CD Projekt Red was lying when they presented this. It just comes down to what a lot of people believe or choose to believe when they see that statement, and how eager people are to believe that this is what the game's actually going to look like when it comes out. Now, biggest problem with this trailer, that being said, is the Metro system. They showed V riding on the Metro system, and forever would this dog them until they actually put the Metro system back in the game. So if you're ever wondering why people were so obsessed with there being a Metro system, this trailer. As sort of a backup to their bluff, a few months later, CD Projekt Red would release a 48-minute long gameplay video showing off what was supposedly the state of the game at that time. So this was still later in 2018. 2 years plus before the game would come out. A lot of people have pointed at this footage and said that, this was all a lie, and that, the game wasn't even close to this and looks more like the bug videos that we've seen. But I think that, again, this is something that's really deceptive, because when you look at this, again, comparing it to having played the final game, you can see that all of this stuff is from this early part of the game that works pretty well and is really polished, even when running on a base Xbox One or PS4. The opening prologue mission of the game works pretty well, and so seeing all this now, it's like, okay, it's not surprising that they were able to show this to the public in a pretty functional state. Another thing that's really important to keep in mind about games that struggle at release is the more powerful the hardware it's running on, usually the less visible problems are. I'm going to talk about this a lot more when I'm showing analysis of the game running in its launch and shortly after launch versions. But one of the biggest things that makes games break is when different components of the game engine are not in sync. And this is exacerbated by how slow different parts of a computer are, especially a slow hard drive, things like that can make a game run totally differently. And, it's an oversimplification, but the fact that it runs so incredibly badly on a base PS4 and an Xbox One versus you can just throw the exact same version of the game on a high-end PC and it's almost like a totally different game. It runs fantastic. An example of this that's kind of funny is I played Sonic the Hedgehog 06 for the first time on the Xenia emulator, and the game runs at 60 frames per second all the time if you have a decent computer. And so many of the problems that people have just, laughed about for years, and like, what is wrong with this game? When the game is running at full speed and everything's in sync, that stuff doesn't happen, and it's like twice as good of a game. It's not a perfect game. That still only makes it like a pretty decent game, but it's like a totally different game when it's running the way it's supposed to, and that is extremely true about Cyberpunk 2077. And it really doesn't surprise me looking at this footage of the game running on a high-end PC, because I've now had the chance to run the game in its launch version on a newer, better computer than what I had at the time. And the game actually runs pretty decent. There's a few funny glitches every once in a while, like the one I always joke about where suddenly you have a penis hanging out of your pants, whether your character has a penis or not. And, it's just one of those great, like, kick me, point at the game kind of things of a bug happening. But as far as actually completing the missions and getting through the game, on a high-end PC, even the launch version of this game works really well. And so seeing it like this in a really controlled area and it running well, it's not actually that hard for me to believe that they had that up and running in 2018. And I don't think that this is that doctored. It's more kind of indicative that they had the game running pretty well on high-end PCs even 2+ years before the game came out. And even right up until the game came out, they either ignored what the people on the optimization and porting teams were saying about its performance on Xbox One and PS4, or they just put it as a low priority and just didn't deal with it. They were aware that it didn't run well on those systems, but they were just willing to keep putting it on the back burner over and over again, and those versions didn't catch up for a very, very long time. I mean, I think it was something like version 1.5 or something, to where you could say that the game was fully functional on those consoles and all the systems were in place, and playing the game on PC with the settings turned down and playing the game on PS4 or Xbox One was pretty comparable, versus there was just stuff straight up not functioning at all on the console versions. And for that level of disparity on a high profile multi-platform release to exist, it's kind of absurd, honestly. And there's a lot of stuff of where I want you to have some compassion for the developers and how hard they work, and that CDPR are just a company that make honest mistakes and all of that. But then there's some points, on the other hand, where we could go back and you could probably look up whose call this was to make about these things and just be like, you know what? That person was a freaking idiot. And that's not generally my goal, is to point fingers at stuff, but some of the decisions made on this game of how the console versions especially being that far behind, when what we can see by, if you look at the 1.63 version of Cyberpunk running on even a base PS4 or Xbox One, it runs just fine. You know, I mean, obviously it doesn't look anything near as good as the PC version, but it runs just fine. And it's totally perfectly well optimized and runs about as well as you could expect any late, you know, generation console game. Like if you compare it to how Destiny 2 runs on those systems or something else that was like a cross-platform title, it you know, there's nothing that weird or ugly about it in how it runs. It runs just fine. So it was possible the whole time. And the fact that that didn't happen, even compared to the worst examples you think of where it's like there's games like Batman Arkham Knight, where it just, you know, like the game at launch totally didn't function on PC, but on console it was, you know, it was fine. Like there were flaws with the game, but you could just fire it up and play it. Whereas when you tried to play it on the PC, it would just crash, it would corrupt your save data. There was all kinds of ridiculous problems. There are a few other examples like that compare to Cyberpunk 2077 of how badly a console port and optimization was handled versus the PC version. Because I don't think that this is really a lie, what you're looking at here. I just think it's a testament to how long before the game released they had it running decently on high-end PCs, which, as a side, the whole concept that everyone has a high-end PC and how developers will deprioritize optimizing games for low-end PCs or mid-range PCs. Steam's hardware surveys show that most people game on mid-range PCs, so it seems to me like the developers should actually have to spend most of their development time optimizing for mid-range PCs and testing on mid-range PCs, since that's what most people are going to be playing on. But hey, maybe that doesn't make sense in the real world. I understand they have to standardize with the level of hardware for everyone to work on, but completely neglecting it just seems like a stupid oversight. I played the game on a mid-range PC when it came out. I think I had like an RX 570 or something like that. And it was, you know, within the range of specs, like between the minimum and the recommended for the game. And it was nowhere near as bad as playing on a PS4, but it was definitely worse than if you were playing on a high-end graphics card at the time. And that's just stupid, considering that's how most people who are buying the game are going to be playing it. While we're talking about this footage, though, I want to talk about another thing that's kind of a criticism, but it depends on how you interpret it. So you'll notice that the rasterized lighting effects, which, by the way, rasterized, I could go into a long explanation, but basically that's the old school effects before ray tracing that games used in the past. You'll notice that they're a fair amount more advanced than what ships in the final game, and there were a few brief mentions by developers saying that they had a more advanced lighting engine going, but it was too resource intensive and didn't run well, and so they had to scrap it. And a lot of people have speculated that this is why they doubled down on NVIDIA's ray tracing technology so early and have put so much into that, is because the system that they were originally going through was too costly, made the game run too slow, wasn't going to work across all platforms. That makes a lot of sense. And so it's interesting because, you know, we can look at this and say, well, I wish I had the option and they would have kept working on this so that I could have turned this on and had this or ray tracing as another option. But, you know, it's up to the developers to decide when they need to cut their losses and move to another technology. And the result was a lot of development into ray tracing very early on, as soon as NVIDIA released the technology, because a major high-profile game was working on it. Even alongside just putting basic fixes out for the game, CD Projekt Red has been trying to remain cutting edge with what they've integrated into the game, even down to they just released it's like integration with an immersive sound software a week ago. I didn't look into it too much, but it's another one of those things of where they're trying to put the newest and coolest technology in their game to make the experiences immersive and as realistic as possible. And so it kind of comes down to interpretation. If you wish they would have optimized the way this system looked beforehand that didn't require the use of ray trace graphics cards, Or if, you're happy that they sort of jump-started that and we've gone to the point now of where the path trace lighting in Cyberpunk 2077, it looks pretty darn amazing. Not everybody can do it, myself included, but it definitely is very impressive, and I'm glad that that technology was developed and worked on, and that the game now is capable of looking significantly better than what you see in this footage, in my opinion. Before I move on to discussing the final period before the game's release, I just want to say, looking at this footage, if you were able to go straight from this to what the game is actually like to play on a pretty high-end PC at the time at the game's release, and remove a lot of missteps in between, you could pretty much eliminate most of the negativity around this game. Sure, there are flaws in the experience as a whole that have nothing to do with bad performance or bugs that are mostly brought on by slower hardware, but the game, compared to what else was available at the time, it wouldn't have tipped the scale to bring gamers rage if not for all of the decisions that led to the console ports being so bad. Now, I know hindsight is 2020, and everyone after the fact knows they could make better decisions. And I'm not saying that I know which hard decisions CD Projekt Red should have made at this point, but I definitely think some difficult decision, besides pretending they could just forge on as they hoped and release the game anyway, is what needed to be done. Now, whether that was to cancel the then current generation console versions, because it's important to remember that the new consoles were just releasing at the time when Cyberpunk 2077 came out. So very few people had them. Canceling those versions of the game would have been really, really bad for the game's sales and would have made people extremely angry. So that would have been a difficult decision to do. Changing the game to have some sort of early access model where people could try it but it wasn't considered final would be really difficult to do as well at this point, when the game had been marketed as a traditional experience where you pre-order it and it releases fully baked, supposedly, on the day of release. There is not really an easy way that they could have done it. Now, it's hard to compare where CD Projekt Red is at now versus where their goodwill with the gaming public was at the lowest point versus where they were at right before launch and what they could have got away with. I think they probably could have done something bolder and more honest than what they did. CD Projekt Red have admitted as much themselves and pretty much fallen on their swords in the years since. But I guess my point in saying this is to say that I think that their statements of where they went wrong and their own self-reflection on that is pretty accurate, in that where they really went wrong was not paying attention to how far behind the console versions were falling. It really wasn't that bad when running on a good computer. We've heard all of these statements from various industry analysts and from the developers themselves over the years. And looking at it all and just sitting here going through and looking at all this footage over and over again in slow motion, forward and back, I feel like it's not an inaccurate thing to say, and I have a fair amount of experience with this game engine at this point, starting with at the release, of course, and not getting a look at these versions, though I would love to. If CD Projekt Red ever decided to open up, like I think all game developers should do, and just let documentarians in on this stuff and let us all document it, I would love to. But anyway, going just from the released game engine and looking back at this, I think that it's not impossible to see how they got there as a company trying to make a video game and making mistakes along the way. And if we're going to talk about mistakes concerning this game, the biggest one is the perception of, and the reality of, honestly, lies about the state of this game before its release. Now, this is CD Projekt Red's officially released PlayStation footage of the game, released just a little bit, I think less than a month before the game came out. And this, I don't know how else to slice it. I mean, first of all, they're only showing it on a PlayStation 4 Pro and a PlayStation 5, but I strongly suspect that they're also using a PlayStation 4 Pro that's had its internal drive upgraded to a solid-state drive, which is a little bit of a benefit even on the older systems that are not optimized for solid-state drives, and that it's possible that the system's even modded in some way and overclocked. because the performance just straight up seems better than the PS4 Pro at launch. I had a PS4 Pro when this game came out. It's one of the systems I tested it on, and it definitely ran a lot better than the base system, but this is a little hard to believe. And also, the state of this versus how buggy the game was at launch on the consoles, it just doesn't seem quite right to me. Like this scene right here where you see V take the patch off, I've seen this over and over again on consoles, and V's vest does not fully load in, and there are various other small visual glitches in this scene that are just not present. And anytime you load it off a slow 5600 RPM laptop hard drive, those glitches appear in this scene. So the idea that this was just an off-the-shelf PlayStation 4 Pro with its crappy laptop hard drive, I don't believe it for a second. And even though Sony does allow you to upgrade your own hard drive without voiding the warranty, I would say putting a really nice solid-state drive in the system, even if that's all they did, which I seriously doubt, is fairly dishonest in representation of what your average user is going to experience on day one. And I feel that setting that standard of dishonesty, it was a dark cloud that it took a long time for CD Projekt Red to get out from under. And they immediately after, they did one of the worst things that a company can do when caught lying, is try to backpedal and say, oh, well, we weren't really lying. You know, it's all about how you look at this, and it's all from a certain point of view. Luke, I didn't chop off your father's arms and legs and kick him into a river of lava. It's all just a point of view, It's like, that is about the worst thing you can do when someone catches you red-handed lying about something. And this demonstration, it's a bald-faced lie, even if all they did was put a solid-state drive in that PlayStation 4 Pro. And I don't think that that's the case for a minute. I think that they're probably running a newer version than what shipped, at least on disc, on PlayStation 4. The disc versions on consoles are notorious for being buggy and behind even what was available day one on PC, though when both have their day one patch, they're much closer to parity. It's just, all of this overall was a really bad look, and at the end of the day, when you look at it, the base model PS4 was the most popular thing on the market at that time, and what the vast majority of console gamers were going to be playing, and a huge chunk of gamers playing the game in general, even though CD Projekt Red is very popular as a PC developer first, before they started porting their games to consoles. And a lot of their sales disproportionately were going to be on PC for this game. That being said, PlayStation 4 base model is a huge chunk of the sales that should not be discounted. And the fact that they were at bare minimum trying to hide what performance looked like on a base model PS4, doctor up the performance on the PS4 Pro, and all of these other just little deceptions leading up to the launch of the game, it really put a bad taste in the mouth of gamers. And again, it's something that CD Projekt Red really struggled to get out from under. This brings us into the second part of this video, where it transitions into showing it on a PlayStation 5. And I feel like this is another part of, around the time of launch, CD Projekt Red became very tone deaf and seemingly very unable to step back and take an objective look at themselves and how their messaging appeared. You can very clearly see that they're showing off that the game looks and runs better on the PlayStation 5, which means although they're not officially releasing PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series versions at launch, they've already begun to optimize the game for that, and internally you can tell that they're already thinking of that as the main console version. So without seeming to even realize it, CD Projekt Red has given the impression to anyone who's reading behind the lines and really looking at this, that before the game even comes out and they've even delivered the stuff that people have paid for ahead of time, they're leaving the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One behind, and they're now moving to make the experience better for the few people a hold of these systems, which at this time it was kind of a cultural war thing about getting the new systems, because people were, using methods to buy them all up, using online tools without even having to wait in line. and they were then scalping them online, and there was this perception that only rich people had PlayStation 5s and Xbox Series. Though I want to say I did score a Series X myself by just clicking a button like a maniac and sitting there and being patient. So that perception was not entirely true, that everyone who got one was a scalper. But that was kind of the way things were at that time. And so giving this idea that it's like, okay, we're already ditching you for the people who have, you know, paid twice what this thing is supposed to cost to secure themselves a fancy new system. We're making them our main console gamers because we view them as sort of like the PC master race, as unlike you peasants on the PlayStation 4. As ridiculous as that statement sounds, to the person who is the most emotional and already starting to feel like they've been left behind because they're not even showing base model PlayStation 4 footage in this video, that's kind of what it felt like. It was in this climate of huge hype, huge promises, and the start of little lies that Cyberpunk 2077 would launch in arguably one of the biggest video game launches of all time. In our next episode about that launch, I'll be comparing a lot of the functions and features in the game as launched, compared to how CD Projekt Red described some of this stuff and some of the hype they built up around some of the things in the game, like weapon customization, vehicle customization, all sorts of little things that may not seem that important on their own, but when you look at what was actually in the game in the launch state, versus even stuff that was demonstrated in what appeared to be functioning in the game before release, it led to gamers really feeling like they'd been ripped off by this game, they'd been cheated, they'd been lied to. This stuff all came from somewhere, not just gamers being mean little trolls who live in their mother's basements and can't control their own emotions. A lot went into this perception, and CD Projekt Red created this situation by decisions that they actively made. It wasn't just a bunch of errors committed by Mr. Magoo. A lot of this stuff was very much by design. And we'll talk about how one of the biggest launches in history turned into probably the biggest fiasco in the history of video game launches, and that's honestly saying something. I've seen a few. But that's all coming in our next episode. These videos are kind of the culmination of all my time spent with this game, and a lot of footage and a lot of stuff has gone into this, and there's still quite a bit more I'm going to need to record as I go forward. Some of it could be a little tedious, so I'm thinking of maybe doing some streams as I go up version by version and just fiddle with stuff. That might be a kind of fun thing to do to interface with the community, or I might just decide to do it myself. Not decided yet, but let me know in the comments what you think about that, if that's something you'd want to watch, is me showing off different versions of the game. Also, I appreciate your patience on this first episode since I'm not hacking CD Projekt Red and stealing data from them, I don't have access to the pre-release versions of the game. So we can't really go in and analyze much besides the footage that they've provided and a little bit that's leaked out. It'll be a lot more really demonstrative of what's going on in the game when I can just sit there with console commands and tell it what to do and, you know, throw frame rate graphs on things like that and more easily demonstrate what I'm trying to tell you when I have more control. So definitely appreciate you listening to me talk while I show you footage you've probably seen before. Next episode we're going to go into more of the footage that I captured myself over the years making videos about this game. Thanks for watching. If you've made it to the end of the video, you know, same as always, make a sandwich, call your granny, do something wholesome. Have yourself a good one, and I will see you next time. It'll be done when it's ready.